Hi everybody, and welcome to our material for week 2 of our course. This video is just going to get into like 4 main points, 4 big kind of concepts that I want to get across, and then we'll meet in person and talk about these a little more in depth. And there's also some other video links that you're going to watch here. So what we're going to do, or what you have to do for this week, is A, watch this video. Congratulations, already there. We're going to watch the other video links that I have on this assignment that are looking at the Fukushima example. And the reason why we're looking at Fukushima this week is just really to kind of understand a little better how people experience places in different ways. And sometimes when there's like a disaster, it's a good way to sort of see just how people are usually using places differently even when there's not a disaster. So kind of using it as that kind of example. And when we meet in class, we'll talk a little bit more about these major concepts, dig into the Fukushima example a bit more, and we'll also do a mapping exercise to look at how people inhabit places and experience them in different ways. All right, so I'm going to just focus on 4 key points in this video. And there are 4 key things that I want you to kind of to know. Obviously, this stuff that can be on the will definitely be on the exams and that kind of stuff. The first main point is the definition of scale. I'm going to use that in a lot of things during this whole course. And scale really has to do with sort of, the idea that events and processes in the world cover different areas, and they have different levels of reach. So sort of a general definition of scale is the spatial extent over which something happens, right? And so sometimes people will talk about the global scale, or the national scale, or the local scale, right? Different things have effects at different kind of spatial extents in the world. Things can be like global, or it could be just something that's going on in your neighborhood. An example of this would be like, for instance, Ramunto's Pizza, which is a pizza place right here on the corner of campus. Let's say they're having a sale. Where does that matter? Well, really only right here in our neighborhood, right? The scale that matters is right here in Keene and kind of downtown. Now, if Domino's is having a sale at all of their stores, well, that affects a much different scale, right? Because there are Domino's all around the country and all around the world. And so we would say the scale of that sale would be, much more larger, like the national or maybe even the global scale, whereas Ramunto's sale is really only important as a local scale kind of phenomenon, right? And so, a little something to think about when we talk about things in this course. And it's the idea that everything that matters, right? Anything that we're studying or looking at, everything that matters only matters to some people in some places and for some limited length of time. So for instance, you could take any kind of event or thing that's going on and realize that it only affects some people for some things. So like obviously it's different for different things. So for instance, the global pandemic right now with COVID, that's something that clearly has a global effect. It's going to affect us probably for a long time, both in terms of when we have to do quarantine and wear masks, but also some of the economic effects. So, but still, there will be a time way down the road where this isn't even remembered, or certainly doesn't seem to have a very big effect, right? If we go 1,000,000 years from now, who's going to even know about it? All right. And so it's important to kind of realize that as we're talking about things, right, as we go through this course. All right. Key point number 2. We have to think a little bit about how we understand places, how we study them. And so place might seem like one of those things that's really kind of obvious, like Keene is a place, Boston is a place, New York City is a place, right? But if we think about how we understand what's going on in a particular location, so like we want to know about the human activity, right? What's the society like in a place? What's the culture like in a place like Keene? And why is that different than it is in Rio de Janeiro or Moscow or Tokyo, right? People sometimes will look at a place and just be like, well, it's just different in these different places. But we have to kind of think about why. And one of the things that makes a place unique is that it's affected by its physical environment, right? One way in which Keene is not like Rio de Janeiro in Brazil is that we're not on the ocean, right? It has a very different physical environment. The weather is different there, these sort of things. And that's going to affect what goes on in a place. But one of the other things, I just added a little arrow here, is that also the human activity in a place influences that physical environment. So in a place like Keene, right? We have put little dams on the Ashwelot River because there was a time period where we had factories here in town that kind of ran on river power. And you'll see that in Massachusetts and other areas too, all over the place, towns that have their mills and their waterfalls and all of that. So human activity kind of affects that physical environment at the same time that it's affected by it. So that's one thing we have to think about to understand why a place is the way it is. But one of the other things we have to think about is its history, in terms of why a place is the way that it is. So for instance, if we're looking at a place like Keene, we have to understand the Native American presence that was here in this area, the effects they may have had in terms of on the physical landscape, in terms of managing the forest through use of fire and other kinds of activities, and then what happened with European immigration when that occurred, and the felling of large areas of forests and the development of farms and sheep farming and all those sort of things. All the way through to the fact that we now have a college here, and that affects what we see in this particular place, right? What makes Keene kind of what it is. But there's another aspect here. It's not just what's the physical environment, what's the history. To understand what's going on in a place, we also have to understand how it interacts with human activity in other places. How many people watching this video today are not from Keene? I'm not from Keene. Many of you are not from Keene. One of the things that makes this place what it is the way in which this place interacts with these other locations. The fact that students come from Connecticut, from other parts of New Hampshire, from Vermont, faculty come from all around the world and come here. That's part of what makes this place what it is, right? Also, if you think about what types of things you might have had for breakfast this morning, I would probably suspect that most of the things that you ate were not grown in New Hampshire, right? Many of the things probably came from other areas. And so one of the things that makes life what it is here, if you woke up and had orange juice, that didn't come from around here, right? It's these systems of interconnection that have kind of made life possible the way that we live it here in Keene. So if you think about this in another context, like say with New York City, one of the things that makes New York City what it is of course its history, its physical environment where the Hudson River meets the Atlantic, its history of European colonization, all those sort of things. But then also the fact that it's really connected to places upriver like Albany, but also to places like Europe across the sea, and the fact that people come there from all over, as tourists or as residents, and that's kind of what makes the place what it is. And so when we talk about places, you have to kind of take this very rich sort of view of what's going on in a location. And then one last thing here is that not only does human activity in other places affect what a place is, but one last arrow, what we do in a particular place has effects elsewhere, right? The whole idea of coming to college in a place like Keene is that you're going to learn things here, and then you're going to go back out to other places, whether it's back to your hometowns or to some other location, and kind of change and shape those places as well, right? Okay. So again, that's one of the key things about this course is when we're talking about different places, we have to understand them in connection, right, with other locations. Okay, point number 3. One of the things when we're studying places that people and researchers like to do is to group places based on some sort of similarity. And you get what are sometimes called regions, right? And a region is essentially, it's a geographical unit based on characteristics and functions of culture. That's the fancy definition from the book. An easier way to probably think about this is it's an area that has a bunch of places that we think are similar in some way. And so there are really kind of 3 types of regions that I'm going to talk about here: formal, functional, and vernacular. And they're terms that, yes, you need to know. So a formal region is where we take some area of the world and we think all the places in there are similar because of some particular trait, usually some sort of cultural trait. So for instance, when we talk about a culture region, it's inhabited by people who have one or more cultural traits in common. So this map here is of a particular cultural region. Any guesses as to what that might be? Well, this was from a Google search where I just put Arab world. Right, so this is essentially the Arab area where you have where Arabic is commonly spoken, and you'll see that it covers a particular area where the places in it have that similarity. Now, does that mean that everything about Morocco is just like everything like Saudi Arabia? No, but they do share in common use of Arabic language. You could also say, well, a lot of these areas are predominantly Muslim. True, but you'll notice this map does not include predominantly Muslim areas like Iran or Turkey, because those are areas where Arabic isn't really kind of the major language. And so one thing about regions is it depends on what you pick in terms of how you define them. And so the boundaries can be a little fuzzy. One thing too, like with this map, this was an old map before Sudan was cut in half, and now there's the country of South Sudan, which is not really Arabic speaking, and so if you look at a newer map, this area here wouldn't even be included. So the lines on what belongs to one region or another is pretty fuzzy. Another way of thinking about regions is what's called functional region. And this is where places are kind of in a common region because they function together, not because they're similar on a cultural trait. So an area like, for instance, the Boston area would be a functional region. It's sort of like people may work in the middle of the city and then live in the suburbs around it and move back and forth, but the whole region sort of functions as a whole. Another example of this, which is this picture here, would be El Paso, Texas, and Ciudad Juarez, which is in Mexico, across the border. Now, they're in different countries. These cities are in different countries. They're even in different, what we might call different formal regions. We might consider El Paso to be part of North America, and then Mexico to be part of Latin America, and kind of separate the regions. But functionally, these two cities actually operate very much in connection with each other across that border. And so functional regions, are all about how things kind of function. And usually they have some sort of node, like a central point. So again, something like Boston area, which is sort of centered around downtown Boston, or New York City, which is sort of centered around Manhattan. But the whole region sort of functions as one. And then the last kind of region we talk about is what's called a vernacular region. And that's a culture region that's perceived to exist by its inhabitants based on some kind of collective perception that it sort of goes by a certain nickname. Like some people will call like the South like Dixie, right? Or even the fact that we call someplace the South in the United States. So it's usually based on some sort of physical environmental features or some sort of historical or political characteristics. Generally, these kind of regions lack sharp boundaries or borders, and it can vary in scale, like, I just said, like the South, right, which is a whole chunk of the United States. Or one of the examples from the textbook is this one part of the Florida Panhandle, which they refer to as the Redneck Riviera. Not the most polite way of referring to it, obviously, but that's kind of what they call that part of the Panhandle. Another good example of a vernacular region would be the one you're in now, which is the Monadnock region, right? All the areas around Mount Monadnock. And if you look at like what areas of New Hampshire here kind of count as the Monadnock region, one thing I like about these different maps that I found is every one of them is different in terms of where the boundaries of the Monadnock region are. Like this map here has Mount Vernon in it, this one doesn't, this one has Milford, this one doesn't. So it's, based on perception. Okay, so those are basically the three kinds of regions. Key point number 4 and the final and last one. And this is what we're really going to get into in our in-class discussions. Not only do we need to talk about scale, right, the extent over which something happens, not only do we have to talk about the idea that places are created in connection and that, we can connect these places together into regions, but we must understand that people experience places differently. So events and processes do not affect everyone in the same way, even in the same place. So like, for instance, just even our campus here at Kane State, not everybody has the same experience of this place. Not everybody finds, if you take any particular place on it, some people will find that to be a safe place. Some people think of it as being potentially threatening. Some people feel welcomed. Some people do not. And these differences based on culture, age, gender, religion, language, political leaning, etc., means that we don't necessarily experience the same places in the same ways. And so the example that these other video links are going to get into really gets into that and this idea from the Fukushima disaster, right? And the way in which it affected people very differently based on their age, their gender, and that sort of thing, these differences. And the reason I'm using this as example is I think it really kind of shows a lot of things that are in operation in our more kind of normal everyday spaces. It's also a place where I do research, or have done research in the past, and so I have a little more knowledge about this particular location. But as you'll see, I think it also has some connections to how we think about how we're dealing with the COVID pandemic as well. So just to give a little background before you go to those other video links, I need to just explain a couple things, which is how did this disaster happen, right? And essentially what occurred was you have this area off the coast of Japan. This is sort of looking deep into the earth and looking at where the Earth's plates kind of come together. And to make a long story short, you had one of the largest earthquakes on record, over a 9.0, that happened offshore. And what happened is as one plate was diving under the other and they get stuck, and then you have this big earthquake, what happens is the crust goes up, it pushes all the water that's above it up, and then that water goes out. And one side of it went all across the Pacific, and the other side went and hit Japan. And when this occurred, this whole area of the seafloor off the coast of Japan essentially ruptured and went upward. And so the areas really close to that then got the brunt of this tsunami, which was an incredibly large tsunami. And so it sent water, kind of rushing into the Japanese coastline. And one of the videos shows you how this, kind of what this looks like or how this happened. And the wave also hit a nuclear plant, the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear plant. And then when that happened, a couple of the reactors were damaged, and they exploded and spewed radioactive material all over this area of Japan. And this happened in 2011, but the problems from this radioactive material being spread all over the place is still there because a lot of the radioactive material has a half-life of close to 30 years, meaning that after the stuff gets spread all over, 30 years later, you're going to have about half of that left. 30 more years, you'll have about a quarter of what you started with. 30 more years, you'll have about an eighth of what you started with. So it's still going to be a problem for quite some time. So the three videos you're going to watch after this one is the one on the tsunami, one about how the reactor blew up, and then one from Vice that just talks a little bit about how people are handling the aftermath of the explosion, which is 15 minutes long. All right, so again, these are the 4 key points. We'll get back, to just kind of do a quick review of these in class when we meet this week. And from here, watch those Fukushima videos, answer the discussion questions about this video and the Fukushima videos, and in class, we're going to get a little more into that example and also do a little bit of mapping exercises. So, all right, that's it, and I will see you in class.